Bruce Rosenberg has made a name for himself in the U.S. in the area of healthcare fraud litigation. He is the co-founder of Rosenberg Law, and he joins us via Zoom from Florida. Hi, Bruce.
Hello, Peter. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being on the program with us. Now, you are speaking to a Canadian, so we have totally different healthcare systems. So I'm going to ask this question from an outsider point of view, and that is there a problem when it comes to healthcare fraud? Is this a big situation? And more importantly, from what angle does this situation take place? Is healthcare fraud something where someone is trying to defraud the healthcare system or as a patient, or where a patient is being defrauded in some way, shape, or form?
What an excellent question, Peter. Having practiced for 30 years and being in the area of being a founding partner of Rosenberg Law, the question is targeted at everybody. Healthcare fraud is a huge problem, and it involves patients committing fraud. It involves providers, healthcare providers committing fraud. It involves non-healthcare providers, non-professionals who are just in the business of fraud, committing fraud by using healthcare services. And as well, oftentimes it can involve insurance carriers equally. It's a problem. It's rampant and it's everywhere. But we also have to be careful to understand that there's a gray area and that there isn't. You have to look cleanly and directly at what is being alleged as fraud, because sometimes it may be and sometimes it isn't. For instance, when a doctor submits a bill that has a code on it that's an ICD code or a CPT code, and the services that were provided are not exactly within the framework of that code, that could just be an error. It could be a simple, bookkeeping or record-keeping mistake. It doesn't necessarily make it fraud, but oftentimes the government will come in and say, no, there are too many of these errors and you've committed fraud. So you have to look at it from which perspective do you want to talk? Do you want to talk about patients committing fraud? Yes, patients commit fraud all the time. They go into multiple doctors, seek multiple services, seek multiple reimbursements. They seek benefits that they're not entitled to. So it depends what area you want to focus on, and we can talk about that specific area.
Okay, well, let's back up a second. When we talked about, you said doctors' codes. What exactly are the doctors' codes you're referring to? And when you come across situations that involve doctors' codes, is it a situation where someone is actually trying to defraud or just a clerical mistake?
Well, yeah, that's exactly what the test involved is. Is it intentional fraud or is it an error? Because if it's merely an error, then there are civil monetary penalties that would be involved. But when the intention or neglect or it becomes too much and it rolls over past being a civil issue into a criminal issue, that's when the fraud and the criminal penalties come into it. Now, a CPT code, for instance, is a current procedural terminology. That's what it stands for. And it describes, for billing purposes, the services that are being provided to the patient by the healthcare professional. So for instance, if you go into your doctor and you have a physical examination, there'll be a code that's associated with that examination, and it'll have a different number associated with the complexity and the time duration of the evaluation. And so in the most extreme or longest case, you'll have a code with a 5 at the end or a 4 at the end. And in the simplest evaluation, where it's a shorter period of time for, say, 15 minutes, you'll have a 1 at the end. And the amount the doctor gets reimbursed for that service is going to be dependent on the amount of time and complexity involved in the evaluation. So oftentimes you might have a patient go in for your evaluation, your physical, and the doctor spends 20 minutes with you, but the doctor bills for the code for 45 minutes or for 50 minutes. And so there gets to be an issue on whether or not that's something that was actually supported by the complexity of the decision making involved in the evaluation, or whether it was overbilling because the doctor simply wanted to put it, get paid for a little bit more time than was actually spent with the patient.
In your estimation, as someone who is a legal professional in this realm for a very long period of time, what do you consider to be the greater number of cases? Is it ones involving fraud by the provider as opposed to fraud by the user?
I think I've seen more litigation involving the providers, meaning there's more focus on the providers because the providers are submitting billing to either the government through Medicare or other entitlement programs, as well as to commercial carriers. And there's a lot more money involved in the number of bills being submitted as opposed to an individual. But yet there are individuals, again, who will go in and commit insurance fraud, whether it be for healthcare purposes. In other words, there's a lot of no-fault fraud or car accidents where the victims claim to be injured severely, but they aren't. And we've all seen those stories or heard those stories where the investigator will show somebody complaining, showing up in a wheelchair with a neck brace, but then there'll be an investigator who goes out and takes a picture of them playing football with their friends, which directly contradicts their claim of being injured. So there's fraud is a component part of all healthcare and insurance. I'm not going to say that it's overwhelming. It is something common, and it needs to be avoided. But oftentimes there's overreaction or oversimplification of what's happening, and you really have to look carefully at really what's going on before you call it fraud.
Well, not to take money out of the business that you do on a regular basis, but when it comes to provider fraud, do you think that could be checked a little bit if there were more of a checks and balances on basically the paperwork that is done by the providers to gloss over or glean over whatever potential fraud might be there?
Well, absolutely. I think that review of documentation is crucial in determining whether or not billing is appropriate or not. And that gets down to, the very basics, which would be the medical record that's created by the provider, which has got to justify the services, as well as the containing sufficient basis, in other words, the component parts in the medical records that will match with the billing code. But then again, given electronic software, given computers, bills are submitted now, and a lot of them are processed under computer applications that have OCR, or optical recognition review, and they simply and those programs simply look to flag and make sure that the code is correct, or that the information is filled in properly. And the further review by either the adjuster or whoever is involved in determining whether the bill is valid don't necessarily use the tools or scrutinize the bills sufficiently, or simply ask for additional information if they think something is missing. So right now, given the electronic review of records, I think that there should be more focus put on the software companies, and as well as the programs that are used to determine whether or not the bills are valid or sufficient before they're being paid or declined.
Earlier, you mentioned the difference between civil and criminal when it comes to healthcare fraud. Do you have any figures that tells us what percentage of healthcare fraud is criminal versus civil?
No, that's hard to tell. I think the way Medicare set up its compliance programs and its penalty programs, the point of compliance was to focus on acts and practices which would ensure or avoid fraud from happening. And the way that Medicare uh, gave guidance and said that civil monetary penalties or a review of actions where it's an error, where it's malpractice, where it's simply overlooking or an oversight, that's not going to be a criminal action, or it shouldn't be. It's only when it becomes an intentional action and or a situation where there's intentional neglect or intentional avoidance of facts that are clear on their face, then that's when the situation triggers over or reaches the benchmark and goes from being just a civil problem where there may be a monetary penalty involved to being an enforcement action where criminality is involved and prosecutions where there are penalties involving criminal implications. So you always have to look at, is it simply neglect, or is it an intentional action which should be punished? Because when you have a provider or a patient that's doing something intentionally to game the system or to make money off the system for inappropriate purposes, that is criminal. But where a doctor is simply doing their job and maintaining their records, just it may not be in a manner that is, sufficient for some people, doesn't mean that that's criminal. It just means that maybe they need to have their record keeping systems improved. And that's something that maybe a penalty should be assessed, but it's not something that should rise to the level of a criminal charge.
And finally, from the perspective of either the provider or the user, are there any tips that you can suggest that would help either side recognize potential fraud coming their way?
Well, I think from the user, from the patient's perspective, you need to be aware of what the provider is doing for you and paying attention to. Are you getting the services that are being billed for? And inevitably, if you have insurance or entitlement program, you're going to get explanations of benefit that are going to explain what the bill was for, what is being compensated by the entitlement program or by the insurance carrier. It would also, the explanation of benefits will explain if you have a responsibility, whether it be a copay or deductible or your share, the patient's share of the responsibility for payment. And so on those explanations, you're going to be able to see, did you get that service or did you not? And if it's something you didn't get, you should report that immediately to your insurance carrier, because that's a problem if you're getting billed for services that you didn't get. And so I think that being aware of what the doctor or what the provider is claiming that they're providing to you and what they're billing for is the first step in protecting against that, against overbilling.
And on the other side, on the provider side?
On the provider side, I think you need to implement programs and a culture that looks to have compliance as your culture, so that your records are kept appropriately, that you're always auditing yourself to make sure that you are delivering the services that you're billing for, and that the services that you're providing are actually appropriate and required for the patient's care.
And are there any red flags, and again, I'm talking from the provider side now, are there any red flags that you should be aware of when it comes to a user perpetrating fraud?
I think that providers, doctors should be aware, and they are aware of common traits or personalities of patients that indicate that maybe somebody's seeking services that aren't required, whether it be after an accident or whether it be for pain medication or otherwise. Professionals are pretty well trained and aware, and usually are looking for inconsistencies or red flags where a patient might be seeking services or drugs or other items that they don't need. So I think that's part of the professional's training, and should always be in the perspective of the provider to make sure that they're not falling prey to somebody claiming to be injured when they aren't.
Fascinating topic indeed. Thank you very much, Bruce, for doing this and being on with us.
Peter, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure, and I look forward to speaking to you again.